On the 19th of April, 1891, two trains on the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway ran into each other outside a small town called Kipton in northern Ohio. A fast mail train and a passenger train had been given orders that depended on one of them being in a siding at a particular minute. It was not. The investigation that followed concluded that the cause was a watch. An engineer's timepiece had stopped for a few minutes and then started again, so that a man responsible for a moving train had looked down, read a number, and believed it. That account has been repeated in American railroad histories for more than a century, and some of its details are difficult to verify at this distance. What is not in doubt is what the railroads did about it. Within months, the industry had adopted a formal standard defining what a railroad worker's watch had to be, how accurate it had to run, and how often it had to be inspected and certified by an approved examiner. A man could be removed from duty over the condition of the object in his waistcoat. Look at what that standard actually demanded, because it tells you what Americans in that decade thought a watch was for. A railroad-grade watch had to be a specific size. It had to have a minimum number of jeweled bearings at the points of highest friction. It had to be adjusted so that it kept the same rate whether it was lying flat, standing on its edge, or hanging in a pocket, and adjusted again so that it did not drift when the temperature changed between a heated office and an open cab in January. The dial had to be white with plain black Arabic numerals, because a man reading it in poor light at speed should not have to interpret anything. The hands had to be set by removing the crystal and moving a lever rather than by pulling the crown, so that a watch could not be knocked out of time by accident inside a coat. And it had to run within 30 seconds a week. Not a day, a week. An inspector checked it on a schedule, compared it against a standard, entered the result on a card the man carried, and a watch that failed took the man off the train with it. By the 1890s, the pocket watch in the United States was not an accessory. It was a licensed instrument, a mark of responsibility, and, for a great many working American men, the single most valuable object they owned. And at that exact moment, in the same decade, there already existed a version of the same machine that could be worn on the wrist, where a man could read it in a fraction of a second without using his hands at all. Almost no man on earth would have been seen wearing one, because it was understood to be jewelry for women. So how does an object that American men openly mocked become the thing on nearly every one of their wrists inside of 30 years, and what had to happen to the world to change their minds? To understand the contempt, you have to understand what the pocket watch actually meant. A pocket watch was carried in the waistcoat, secured by a chain that ran across the front of the body and anchored on the other side, often ending in a fob or a seal. That whole arrangement was visible. It sat across a man's stomach at the exact height where other people looked at him, and it announced several things at once. It said he owned something expensive and precise. It said he had somewhere to be at a fixed hour, which is to say, he had a position. In the American context, it might also say he was certified to run a train. The watch itself was engineering that ordinary people otherwise never held. Hundreds of parts, jeweled bearings, a balance wheel oscillating steadily inside a sealed case, and the whole thing built to a tolerance that almost nothing else in a 19th century home could match. That object had a smaller relative, and the smaller relative had an entirely different social meaning. Watches worn on the wrist or upper arm are old. There is a documented reference from 1571 to an arm watch presented to Queen Elizabeth I by Robert Dudley, which was an armlet with a clock set into it. It was described as a jewel that happened to tell the time, and that description held for the next 300 years. In 1810, Caroline Murat, Queen of Naples and a sister of Napoleon Bonaparte, ordered a timepiece from Abraham Louis Breguet in Paris that was to be worn on the wrist on a bracelet of hair and gold thread. It was delivered in 1812, and it is generally regarded as the first true wristwatch. In 1868, the firm of Patek Philippe produced a wristwatch for a Hungarian countess. Notice what all three have in common. They were commissioned by women, made as jewelry, and priced as jewelry. By the late 19th century, catalogs across Europe and America sold wristwatches in the ladies' pages, alongside brooches and bracelets, and the English-speaking trade had a name for them. They were called wristlets, and the word carried a sneer. There is a saying from the period, repeated in a great many books about watches, in which a man declares he would sooner wear a skirt than a wristlet. The exact wording changes from source to source, and no one has convincingly traced it to an original speaker, which suggests it was less a quotation than a sentiment common enough that everyone recognized it. The sentiment is what matters. A man who strapped a watch to his arm in 1895 was making a statement about himself that he almost certainly did not want to make. And then, over the following 20 years, the profession least interested in fashion and most interested in results changed its mind about the whole question. The pressure did not come from watchmakers, and it did not come from customers. It came from officers who had discovered, in a series of colonial wars, that the thing they needed most in the field was to know the time without stopping what they were doing. Wristwatches were reaching soldiers well before the First World War. Individual officers had watchmakers solder wire loops onto small pocket watch cases so a leather strap could be fitted. Others bought leather cups that a pocket watch could be pushed into and buckled to the forearm. These were improvisations, and the men who made them were doing it in spite of the social meaning, not because the meaning had changed. There are various claims about which manufacturer first supplied military wristwatches in quantity, including a well-known account involving German naval officers in the 1880s. Those claims tend to come from the companies themselves, and the surviving documentation is thin. What is well attested is that by the South African War at the turn of the century, British officers were using wrist-worn watches in the field in numbers large enough that the practice was being written about at home. The reason was tactical and specific. Colonial campaigns were being fought by columns operating out of sight of each other, and the only way to make separate units act as one was to agree in advance on a time and trust everyone to keep it. An officer who had to stop, plant his feet, and go into his coat to find out whether the moment had arrived was an officer who was not doing anything else. The other early adopter was the newest profession on Earth. In 1904, a Brazilian aviator named Alberto Santos Dumont, who was then one of the most famous men in Paris for flying powered airships over the city, complained to his friend Louis Cartier that he could not check a pocket watch while flying. Both of his hands were occupied, keeping the machine in the air, and taking one off to dig into his clothing was not a reasonable thing to ask. Cartier designed him a flat, square-cased watch with a leather strap and an exposed dial, meant to be read with a glance at the wrist while the hands stayed where they were. Santos Dumont wore it publicly, which mattered because he was a celebrity and he was unambiguously not a woman. Cartier put the design into commercial production a few years later under the Aviators name. The wristwatch had acquired its first genuinely masculine association, and it had acquired it from a man who needed both hands to avoid falling out of the sky, which was a preview of what happened when several million men were put into a situation where letting go of what they were holding could kill them. Here is the part that explains everything, and it is a matter of seconds. Count what a pocket watch actually requires. You stop moving. You free a hand. You find the coat opening, which on a soldier means getting past webbing and equipment straps. You reach in, locate the watch, draw it out, and if it is a hunter case, you press the catch and open the lid. Then you read it. Then you reverse the entire sequence, because a dangling watch on a chain will be lost or smashed. That is somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds. It needs at least one hand, and usually the cooperation of the other. And it requires you to look down and away from whatever else you are looking at. Now count the wrist. You turn your forearm. You read. You're already doing something else with both hands the entire time. For most of history, the difference between those two sequences was worth nothing because almost nothing a person did was measured in seconds. Artillery changed that. By the middle of the First World War, the technique that infantry attacks depended on was the creeping barrage. Guns positioned miles behind the line dropped shells in a line just ahead of advancing troops, and that line of fire was moved forward on a schedule, so many yards every so many minutes, written out in advance and distributed as a timetable. The infantry had to follow it closely enough to arrive at the enemy position while the defenders were still under cover, and not so closely that they walked into their own shells. The gunners could not see them. There was no radio at the level of the infantry platoon. Nothing connected the two except the fact that both were working from the same schedule and both were watching a watch. Synchronization stopped being administration and became the difference between taking a position and being cut down in the open. And the officer doing the watching was, at that moment, holding a pistol or a whistle, climbing a ladder, or lying in mud with his other hand, keeping his head down. He could not go into his coat. Nobody could. So the watches changed shape to survive the wrist. Manufacturers moved from soldering wire loops onto pocket watch cases to designing purpose-built cases with integrated lugs, the small projections on either side that a strap threads through. Look at your own wrist, or at any watch on any wrist near you. Those two pairs of horns are there because somebody had to stop gluing a pocket watch to a leather cup and build the strap into the object. Glass was the next problem. A watch face on the back of the wrist was exposed to everything the trench could do to it, so makers fitted pierced metal covers and grills over the crystal, which is why watches from those years look as though they are wearing armor. They were. And then there was the dark, which is where this story turns. That is the kind of thing this channel exists to find. And if it is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and takes about a second. What the industry did next killed people for 40 years. A watch that cannot be read at night is useless to an army that attacks before dawn. And in the first decades of the 20th century, there was a new answer to that problem that seemed close to miraculous. Radium had been isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, and one of its properties is that it makes certain compounds glow. Mixed into a paint with zinc sulfide, a trace of radium produced a substance that emitted a steady greenish light for years without any power source and without needing to be charged by daylight. Painted onto the numerals and hands of a watch dial, it made the time readable in complete darkness. It was sold in the United States under the trade name Undark, and the military demand during the First World War outran every factory that could meet it. Factories were set up to meet it, and the work of painting those dials was done almost exclusively by young women, hired because the job required steady hands and very fine control. The brushes were made of camel hair, and they had to be kept to a sharp point to paint numerals a millimeter wide. The technique the companies taught was to shape the brush with the lips between strokes. Lip, dip, paint. A dial painter did this hundreds of times a shift. Radium in the body behaves chemically like calcium, which means it is deposited into bone, where it stays, irradiating the tissue around it from the inside for the rest of the person's life. The women were told it was safe. Some of them painted their nails and teeth with it for fun, because it glowed. The scientists and executives who handled the raw material in the same buildings used lead screens, tongs, and protective clothing. The consequences began appearing in the 1920s. Teeth loosened and fell out. Jaw bones developed necrosis so severe that in some cases, pieces could be removed by hand. Anemia, fractures from ordinary movements, and bone tumors followed. Doctors, some of them paid by the companies, attributed the deaths to syphilis and to other causes. In 1927, a group of 5 former dial painters in New Jersey, led by a woman named Grace Fryer, brought suit against their former employer. Fryer had left the dial painting job years earlier and had gone to work in a bank. Her teeth began coming out. Her jaw deteriorated. X-rays eventually showed a spine that was disintegrating, and she was fitted with a steel back brace to hold her upright. Getting anyone to take her case took 2 years. Lawyers in New Jersey did not want to sue the largest employer in the town. The science was new and contested, and the company's position was that it had done nothing wrong and that these women were sick from something else. When a young attorney named Raymond Berry finally agreed, he was taking on a corporation with far greater resources on behalf of clients who were visibly running out of time. The press named the plaintiffs the Radium Girls, and the phrase has outlived every person and every company involved. By the time the case came to court, Fryer could not walk unaided. The legal obstacle was brutal in its simplicity. Occupational disease claims in that state had a statute of limitations measured from the point of exposure, and radium poisoning takes years to present. The women were, in effect, being told their claims had expired before they could possibly have known they were injured. The case settled in 1928 under heavy public attention. In the 1930s, a second group in Ottawa, Illinois, fought a longer battle against a different company, and one of them, Catherine Donahue, gave testimony from a bed because she could no longer sit up. That case was won and upheld on appeal in 1938. What those women achieved reaches far past their own compensation. Their cases established in American law that a worker could sue an employer for a disease contracted at work, forced changes to statutes of limitation to account for latent illness, and produced the first serious industrial regulation of radioactive material in the United States. Their medical records became something else as well. When the United States began building nuclear weapons a few years later, the question of how much radioactive material a human body can tolerate had exactly one substantial data set behind it, and it had been generated by young women painting watch dials in New Jersey and Illinois. The exposure limits developed for the Manhattan Project, and much of what followed in radiation protection rest on what happened to them. Radium paint stayed in commercial watch production into the 1960s. If you own a military watch or a household clock from the middle of the 20th century, the numbers on it may still be radioactive, and they will be in human terms, forever. And the object all of that was done for came out of the war, transformed into something no one in 1890 would have believed. A man who had served at the front came home wearing a watch on his wrist, and the meaning of that had inverted. It was no longer a wristlet. It was evidence. It said where he had been and what he had done, and a civilian who had never left the country could not wear one without inviting the comparison. The advertising of the 1920s leaned on this directly, selling wrist-worn watches as service equipment rather than as ornament. The commercial result was one of the fastest reversals in the history of any consumer object. Estimates for around 1930 put the ratio of wristwatches to pocket watches produced at something on the order of 50 to 1. Inside a single generation, a category men had refused to be seen in had all but destroyed the category they had been proud of. The industry then set about proving the new object was tough enough to deserve the trust, and the way it did, that invented something else along the way. In 1926, the firm of Rolex patented a sealed case it called the Oyster, with a screwed-down crown and case back intended to keep out water and dust. The claim was easy to make and hard to believe, so the following year the company found a way to demonstrate it. Mercedes Gleitzer was an English typist and long-distance swimmer who had swum the English Channel. Her achievement had been publicly doubted, and she agreed to repeat the swim to settle the question. She did it in October of 1927, in water cold enough that she had to be pulled out before finishing, and she did it with a Rolex Oyster hanging around her neck. The watch came out working. Rolex bought the entire front page of the Daily Mail to say so. That is generally regarded as one of the first modern celebrity endorsements, and the template has not changed since. Find someone doing something difficult, attach the product, and let the difficulty do the advertising. For the next 40 years, the wristwatch was simply what a person wore. It got waterproof, then self-winding, then anti-magnetic. It went to the bottom of the ocean and to the surface of the moon. Switzerland dominated it so thoroughly that watchmaking became one of the country's largest export industries and a matter of national identity. Then, a Japanese company put a rock in one, and the entire Swiss industry nearly ceased to exist. On the 25th of December, 1969, Seiko put a watch on sale in Tokyo called the Astron. It was the first quartz wristwatch sold commercially anywhere, and it cost about as much as a small car. A mechanical watch keeps time with a balance wheel swinging back and forth against a hairspring, a physical oscillation that can be disturbed by temperature, by position, by magnetism, and by wear. Regulating one is craft, and a very good mechanical watch of 1969 might gain or lose several seconds a day. A quartz crystal, given a small electrical charge, vibrates at a frequency so stable and so high that dividing it down produces a time-keeping signal of a wholly different order. The Astron was accurate to a few seconds a month. That alone would have been a serious problem for Switzerland. What destroyed it was the second property. A mechanical movement is hundreds of parts that must be made, finished, assembled, and adjusted by skilled people. A quartz movement is a circuit, a crystal, a battery, and a stepper motor, and once the tooling exists, it can be produced by machine at a cost that falls every year. Within a decade, a child's allowance could buy a watch that kept better time than anything Switzerland had ever built. The collapse was severe, and it was fast. Swiss watchmaking employment fell from roughly 90,000 people around 1970 to something under 30,000 by the late 1980s, and the number of Swiss watch firms fell by a comparable proportion. Towns whose entire economies rested on the industry lost them. The bitterest detail is that Switzerland had the technology. A Swiss research consortium, funded by the industry itself, had been working on quartz through the 1960s. In parallel with the Japanese effort and roughly level with it. Working Swiss quartz prototypes existed. They were shown at trials. The engineering was not the obstacle. The obstacle was that the Swiss watch industry was not one company. It was hundreds of small firms, many of them family businesses, several generations old, each specializing in one part of a mechanical movement. A firm that had spent 80 years making balance springs had no place in a quartz watch at all. Committing to the new technology meant telling a large part of your own supply chain and a large part of your own country that its skills were finished. They did not do it. They looked at the prototypes and concluded that customers who had always valued craft would keep valuing craft. The customers bought the cheaper watch that kept better time. What saved what remained was an idea that sounds absurd on paper. In 1983, a group led by Nicholas Hayek launched a Swiss quartz watch with a plastic case, built from about half the number of components a normal watch used, assembled by machine, sealed shut so that it could never be repaired, and sold at a price meant to compete with the cheapest imports. They called it the Swatch, and they sold it as a fashion object with no pretension to permanence. It worked well enough to fund the reconstruction of everything above it. And then the strangest thing in this entire story happened, which is that the mechanical watch came back precisely because it had become useless. Once a $20 quartz watch kept better time than any mechanical movement ever made, accuracy stopped being a reason to buy an expensive watch. The industry that survived did so by selling the opposite of accuracy. It sold the fact that hundreds of tiny parts had been made and assembled and adjusted by hand, that the object required winding or wearing to keep running, that it would drift a few seconds a day, and that it could be repaired in a century. Inefficiency became the product. A mechanical watch today is bought for the same reason a person buys a fountain pen or a manual transmission, which is not that it works better, but that it works at all, visibly, in a way the owner can understand. Then the mobile phone arrived and did to the watch what the wristwatch had done to the pocket watch. A generation grew up with an accurate clock in a pocket and saw no reason to wear anything on the wrist at all. Watch sales among young people fell through the 2000s, and the industry began to write obituaries for the habit itself. In 2015, Apple began selling a watch. Within a few years, the company was shipping more watches by unit than the entire Swiss watch industry combined, and the wrist that had been emptied by the telephone was full again, occupied by a device made by a telephone company. And look at what that device is actually selling. It counts your heartbeat. It notices an irregular rhythm and tells you to see a doctor. It detects that you have fallen and calls somebody. It measures your oxygen and your sleep and how much you have moved today. The most valuable thing on the modern wrist is not the time. It is a medical instrument, worn strapped to the arm because that is where the pulse is, and because your hands are busy, which is exactly why the object ended up there in the first place. So look at your own wrist. If there is anything on it, it is held there by two pairs of small projections built into the case, and those exist because officers had watchmakers solder wire loops onto pocket watches in order to survive a war. The face is readable at a glance without using either hand, and that is the entire reason the object exists in this form. It beat the pocket watch not because it was more accurate, which it was not, but because it removed 5 to 10 seconds and one hand from the act of knowing what time it was in a period when armies had built their tactics around a schedule that men had to follow to the minute while being shot at. If it glows in the dark, it is doing so with tritium or with a phosphorescent compound charged by light. And both of those are in use because the substance that did the job first put radium into the bones of young women who were told to shape their brushes with their lips, and because those women went to court while they were dying and changed what an American worker is entitled to. If it is mechanical, it is a deliberately obsolete machine, kept alive by an industry that lost 2/3 of itself to a quartz crystal and rebuilt on the argument that being outperformed by a battery is not the same as being worthless. And if it counts your heartbeat, it has returned to being what it always was on a wrist, which is a tool for a person whose hands are full and who needs to know something without stopping. For 300 years, this was a bracelet. It took a war to make it a man's object, and it took another century for it to become a machine that watches the man instead. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Fabric Myths, because almost everything you put on your body has a story like this one underneath it, and most of them are stranger than you would expect. And tell me 2 things in the comments. First, which part of this surprised you most? Because for most people, it is either the fact that men considered the wristwatch too feminine to wear, or the fact that the glowing numbers came at the cost of the women who painted them. And second, where in the world you are watching from, because I am always curious how far these stories travel. Then tell me which object you want next. And if you want the other thing the First World War permanently changed about what a man wears, the item that cost more soldiers than enemy fire did in some months, go watch The History of Boots, the cardboard soles that killed an army. Same trenches, same mud, and a piece of equipment that took even longer to get right.